2014, the former wife of Saudi Arabia's King Abdullah staged a protest outside the Saudi embassy in London. She called for the release of her 4 adult daughters, who their father's orders had imprisoned.
Behind the walls of one of the most powerful kingdoms on earth lies a story of wealth, betrayal, and silence. 4 daughters of the Saudi king, born into unimaginable privilege, seemed destined for lives of influence and freedom. But their lives took a shocking turn, one that no one outside the palace could have predicted. Stripped of their status and locked away in isolation, these women vanished from the public eye without explanation. For years, their voices have been silenced, their stories hidden behind the towering gates of Saudi palaces. What did they do to deserve this? Were they victims of family disputes, political control, or something far more complicated? The details remain shrouded in secrecy, but fragments of their lives have surfaced. Letters, recordings, cries for help, all pointing to a chilling tale of oppression. What happened to the Saudi king's 4 imprisoned daughters? And why was their fate buried under a veil of power and silence? This is a story of unanswered questions, deep family fractures, and the price of speaking out in a world ruled by authority. Introduction to the protest, 2014. In 2014, a small yet powerful protest outside the Saudi embassy in London captured international attention. Alanoud al-Fayez, the former wife of Saudi Arabia's King Abdullah, stood before the world, demanding freedom for her 4 daughters, Jawahar, Hala, Maha, and Sahar. These women, born into one of the most powerful families on earth, were living a nightmare. For over a decade, they had been held captive by their father's orders, their lives reduced to mere survival in a gilded prison. Why would a father imprison his daughters? What secrets lay hidden behind the opulent walls of the Saudi royal palace? According to Alanoud, her daughters were subjected to starvation, sedation, and constant humiliation. They were denied basic freedoms, left to languish in isolation while their father was celebrated as a progressive reformer. The world struggled to reconcile the image of King Abdullah as a champion of women's rights with the plight of his own children. Background of King Abdullah. King Abdullah bin Abdulaziz Al Saud was no ordinary ruler. He led Saudi Arabia from 2005 until his death in 2015, controlling a fortune estimated at $15 billion. Globally, he was often praised as a modernizer. During his reign, women gained the right to participate in the Shura Council, and more opportunities for education and employment were introduced. For many, these changes symbolized progress in a deeply conservative society. But was this progressive image the whole truth? If Abdullah was truly a reformer, why were his own daughters living as prisoners? While Abdullah expanded rights for women in public, his private actions revealed a different side. Behind closed doors, his daughters suffered in silence, their every move controlled by their father's will. This stark contradiction between public reforms and personal oppression raised unsettling questions about the true extent of change in Saudi Arabia under his rule. Alanoud al-Fayez. Alanoud al-Fayez's life was one shaped by power, wealth, and control. Born in Jordan, she was married off to King Abdullah when she was just 15 years old. Their marriage was arranged, a union dictated by tradition and politics rather than love. Alanoud, a teenager at the time, was thrust into a world of unimaginable luxury, but also isolation. What does it feel like to be surrounded by riches but stripped of agency? To live in a golden cage where every move is monitored? In the years that followed, Alanoud gave birth to 4 daughters, Jawahar, Hala, Maha, and Sahar. For a while, her daughters were her solace, her source of purpose in a world where she often felt invisible. But her inability to bear a son, a prized role in Saudi royal tradition, strained her relationship with Abdullah. The king, disappointed and detached, gradually turned away from her. Eventually, Alanoud found herself estranged from palace life, her once prominent position reduced to a shadow. Still, she stayed for her daughters, believing that her presence might shield them from harm. But by 2003, her situation had become unbearable. What drives a mother to abandon her life of wealth and power? What risks must she face to escape? Escape to London. In a bold move, Alanoud fled to London, leaving behind the palace, the king, and, most painfully, her daughters. The escape wasn't just a rejection of her marriage. It was a cry for freedom from a life where she had no control. But this decision came at an unimaginable cost. Why would she leave her daughters behind? Couldn't she take them with her? Alanoud believed that as adult daughters of the king, her children would remain safe, shielded by their royal status. She could never have imagined the punishment that awaited them. Her escape enraged Abdullah, who saw her defiance as an unforgivable insult. His response was swift and brutal. He imprisoned their daughters, cutting them off from the outside world. The sisters' ordeal. What happens to princesses when the palace turns into a prison? How do they endure years of confinement under the orders of their own father? For the four sisters, life became a nightmare. They were confined to a villa in Jeddah, where their every movement was monitored. Initially, they were allowed limited contact with the outside world. But as they began to speak out, their conditions worsened. Food and water were withheld for days at a time. Medical care was denied, even when they were gravely ill. The sisters' resilience shone through in their efforts to raise awareness. They sent messages to human rights organizations and spoke to journalists, describing the horrors they endured. But every act of defiance came with a price. Princess Hala, in particular, suffered greatly. Known for her courage, she openly criticized Saudi policies, including the treatment of political prisoners. Her activism led to further isolation, and she was eventually sent to a remote women's prison. How does a mother cope, knowing her daughters are suffering thousands of miles away? From London, Alanoud fought tirelessly to free her children. She staged protests, wrote letters to world leaders, and called on the international community to intervene. But the response was muted. Western governments, dependent on Saudi oil and strategic alliances, hesitated to challenge the kingdom. The sisters' lives before imprisonment. Imagine being born into a life of unimaginable wealth and privilege, where luxury and comfort are at your fingertips. This was the life of the four Saudi princesses, Jawahir, Hala, Maha, and Sahar. Their childhood seemed like a dream: grand palaces, the finest education, extravagant travels, and a world that few could ever imagine. They were surrounded by the best of everything, and to the outside world, they were symbols of prosperity and power. But behind the silk curtains of their palaces, was everything really as perfect as it seemed? While the sisters lived surrounded by wealth, their lives were controlled by the strict guardianship laws of Saudi Arabia. These laws, deeply embedded in the country's patriarchal system, meant that every aspect of their lives was under the thumb of a male guardian. For them, that guardian was their father, King Abdullah. Though their father granted them many privileges, he also held the final say over every important decision, from where they could go to whom they could speak with. They were never truly free. Did the luxury of their upbringing come with a hidden price? Imprisonment of the sisters. Everything changed in 2003 when their mother, Alanoud al-Fayez, fled Saudi Arabia, seeking refuge in London. She had been trapped in a marriage to King Abdullah, and she could no longer live under his suffocating control. Her escape was an act of rebellion, a challenge to the very authority that ruled their family. And how did King Abdullah respond to this defiance? In retaliation, he turned his anger toward the daughters he once adored. Despite their adulthood, their mother's escape was seen as an affront, and their freedom was swiftly taken from them. The sisters' passports were confiscated, and they were placed under strict house arrest in one of King Abdullah's private villas. What was once a life of luxury quickly transformed into a prison. But was this confinement truly the worst of what was yet to come? Their situation began to deteriorate further when the sisters started speaking out against the injustice they saw in Saudi Arabia. They criticized the wealth disparity, the corruption within the royal family, and the harsh treatment of ordinary people. Princess Hala, in particular, discovered something that changed everything. Political prisoners were being held in psychiatric hospitals and forcibly sedated. She was appalled and began to raise her voice about the issue. But what happens when you speak out in a regime that thrives on silence? Escalating abuse and isolation. The king's fury grew as the sisters' criticisms continued to spread. They were subjected to increasingly harsh punishments: food deprivation, denial of medical care, and forced sedation. The sisters, who once enjoyed the best of everything, were now reduced to fighting for their basic needs. They were isolated from the outside world and unable to communicate with anyone who could help them. How much longer could they survive in these conditions? The forced sedatives weren't just a method of control, they were designed to break them. The sisters were drugged to the point of mental confusion and physical debilitation. At times, it seemed like they were drifting in a haze, unable to grasp the reality of their situation. The constant manipulation and control took a toll on their health. Princess Hala and Princess Maha, in particular, began to struggle with addiction to the substances forced upon them. But even as their health deteriorated, did the world even notice? A glimmer of hope. In 2014, their mother Alanoud made one final desperate attempt to save her daughters. She staged a protest in London, pleading for the world to pay attention. She publicly fought for their freedom, writing letters and speaking out against the royal family. But despite the outcry, no meaningful action was taken. The sisters remained trapped in their invisible prison. What does it take to break the silence? And why did the world turn away? By 2021, the unthinkable happened. Princess Hala passed away from a chronic illness under mysterious circumstances, followed by Princess Maha just 6 months later. The royal family offered no explanations. Their deaths went largely unacknowledged, leaving behind only questions and a sense of profound loss. Had their voices been silenced forever? As for the remaining sisters, Jawahir and Sahar, their fate is uncertain. Some believe they are still being held captive, while others fear they may have met the same tragic end as their sisters. Their mother, now in London, still holds on to hope that she will one day be reunited with her daughters. But will she ever see them again? What does this story reveal about the world? The story of the Saudi princesses isn't just a tale of tragic family drama. It's a reflection of a world where power can be used to control, silence, and destroy. If women who lived a life of luxury could be treated in such a way, what about the countless others who have no platform, no voice to share their pain? What does this say about the true cost of power? And how much longer can we allow such horrors to go unnoticed? Alanoud's global campaign for her daughter's release. In 2014, Alanoud Al-Fayez, the former wife of King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, took an extraordinary step in her fight to free her daughters. Living in exile in London, Alanoud could no longer sit back and accept the ongoing suffering of her 4 daughters, Princesses Jawahir, Hala, Maha, and Sahar. These young women, once pampered royals, were now imprisoned by their father under his orders. Despite the wealth, the luxury, and the global attention on Saudi Arabia, their lives were filled with unimaginable torment behind the palace walls. Determined to shine a light on their brutal captivity, Alanoud took her battle to the international stage, staging a series of public protests. She gathered outside the Saudi Arabian embassy in London, holding up signs demanding the release of her daughters. It was a bold move, one that carried both personal and political risks. But she knew that her only chance to save her daughters lay in drawing global attention to their plight. What would you do if your children were being held captive, abused, and forgotten? This question, one that Alanoud likely asked herself daily, would soon become a cry for help that the world would hear. She wrote letters to international leaders, including US President Barack Obama, begging him to use his influence to pressure the Saudi government into releasing her daughters. She gave interviews to media outlets, shedding light on the horrific conditions her daughters were enduring. But, as we know too well, the world's attention is often fleeting, and in this case, it didn't lead to the action that was so desperately needed. The limited international response. The international response, while expressing outrage, was ultimately empty. The West condemned the cruelty, but no one dared take real action. Why? Because the Saudi royal family held enormous economic and political influence. Saudi Arabia was, and still is, one of the largest oil producers in the world, and Western governments had long been dependent on the country's resources. So, while politicians might have shared a few sympathetic words, the reality was that their actions didn't match their rhetoric. The powerful oil deals and business ties with Saudi Arabia made it nearly impossible for any meaningful intervention to take place. When Saudi officials were confronted with Alanoud's protests, Their response was chillingly dismissive. This is a private matter. No acknowledgement of the suffering, no acknowledgement of the violation of human rights. Just a cold, heartless dismissal that left Alanoud with little to fight against. What happens when a country's wealth and influence override the basic human rights of its people? This was the harsh truth that Alanoud and her daughters had to face. Her calls for help went unanswered, her pleas ignored. The doors to any meaningful intervention were slammed shut by the very powers that claim to uphold human rights. While Saudi Arabia continued to be a powerful ally for the West, her daughters were left to languish in a private prison, their voices silenced, their lives reduced to mere whispers. Revelations by Dr. Dwight Burdick. However, even amidst this bleak scenario, there were those who tried to make a difference. Dr. Dwight Burdick, an American physician who had been working with the Saudi royal family, held enormous economic and political influence. Saudi Arabia was, and still is, one of the largest oil producers in the world, and Western governments had long been dependent on the country's resources. So, while politicians might have shared a few sympathetic words, the reality was that their actions didn't match their rhetoric. The powerful oil deals and business ties with Saudi Arabia made it nearly impossible for any meaningful intervention to take place. When Saudi officials were confronted with Alanoud's protests, their response was chillingly dismissive. This is a private matter. No acknowledgement of the suffering, no acknowledgement of the violation of human rights. Just a cold, heartless dismissal that left Alanoud with little to fight against. What happens when a country's wealth and influence override the basic human rights of its people? This was the harsh truth that Alanoud and her daughters had to face. Her calls for help went unanswered, her pleas ignored. The doors to any meaningful intervention were slammed shut by the very powers that claim to uphold human rights. While Saudi Arabia continued to be a powerful ally for the West, her daughters were left to languish in a private prison, their voices silenced, their lives reduced to mere whispers. However, even amidst this bleak scenario, there were those who tried to make a difference. Dr. Dwight Burdick, an American physician who had been working with the Saudi royal family for years, became one of the few people to understand the true extent of the princess's suffering. Dr. Burdick had arrived in Saudi Arabia in the mid-1990s, seeking a fresh start in the Middle East. He was offered a prestigious position as a physician for the royal family, providing medical care to some of the most powerful figures in the world. Over time, however, he began to see the cracks beneath the surface of the royal family's facade. The stories of the princesses, once whispered, now impossible to ignore, began to surface. Dr. Burdick's initial encounter with the imprisoned princesses was in 2008, when he was asked to sedate Princess Hala. He was horrified by the request. How could anyone, let alone a doctor, sedate someone against their will? He refused, but his conscience wouldn't allow him to walk away without understanding more. He requested to meet the sisters, and what he saw broke him. He found that Hala and Maha were suffering from severe substance dependency, a result of years of forced sedation, isolation, and trauma. They were living in an environment of constant surveillance, where their every move was watched. Cameras, listening devices. It was like a prison within a palace. Their pain, both physical and psychological, was clear to him. Dr. Burdick's efforts to secure their release. Imagine being trapped in your own body, controlled by the drugs they force on you, and watched by those who are supposed to care for you. This is the heartbreaking reality that Princesses Hala and Maha were living. The once vibrant, intelligent women had been reduced to shadows of themselves. But Burdick, refusing to be a passive observer, continued his visits. He was not just their doctor, he was their lifeline. Through his care, Hala slowly began to recover. For the first time in years, she began to dream of a life outside the prison walls. Burdick saw a glimmer of hope. He suggested that Hala and Maha be sent to a rehabilitation center in California, one of the best in the world. It was a bold proposal, one that offered a chance at a life free from the grip of their father's control. But the royal court's response was swift and cold. They rejected the idea outright, telling Burdick that the princesses would never be allowed to leave Saudi Arabia. He was warned not to pursue the matter further, as it would endanger both him and his wife. This was the extent of the control the Saudi royal family held. not just over their own people, but over anyone who dared to interfere. Burdick's plan for their escape was dashed, but he didn't give up. He continued to visit, continued to offer care, and continued to provide what little hope he could. The death of King Abdullah and the sisters' continued imprisonment. As the years passed, Dr. Burdick witnessed the ongoing suffering of the princesses. He watched as Princess Maha's mental and physical health deteriorated, the once beautiful woman reduced to a fragile, malnourished figure. Even after King Abdullah's death in 2015, the sisters remained imprisoned. Abdullah's death did not bring them freedom. Far from it. It was reported that the king had promised that his daughters would never be released, and it seems that vow was kept. Was their captivity a form of revenge? A cruel way to keep them from ever escaping their father's control? It's impossible to say for certain, but the timing of the deaths of Princess Hala and Princess Maha only added to the growing tragedy. Hala passed away in 2021, followed by Maha just months later. The circumstances of their deaths were shrouded in mystery, with the royal court offering no details, only vague statements. Their deaths were nothing more than a footnote in the Saudi royal family's carefully curated narrative. The mysterious fate of Princesses Jawahar and Sahar. And what of Princesses Jawahar and Sahar? The truth is that, as of now, no one knows for sure. There has been no official word on their fate, no confirmation of whether they are still alive or if they too have perished in silence. The lack of information surrounding their lives leaves a dark cloud of uncertainty hanging over their story. Are they still confined, enduring the same abuse as their sisters? Or have they simply disappeared from the world's view? Alanoud Al-Fayez continues to live in London, still holding on to hope that one day she will be reunited with her daughters. Despite the decades of silence and uncertainty, she refuses to give up. Could a reunion ever happen, or is it too late? The fate of the 4 Saudi princesses remains one of the great tragedies of our time. Proof that even those born into unimaginable wealth and privilege can be silenced by a brutal, oppressive regime. If you found this story as haunting and thought-provoking as we did, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into stories hidden in the shadows of power and secrecy. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. What do you think truly happened to these women, and what should be done to uncover the truth? Until next time, thank you for watching.